65 million years ago, dinosaurs fled the Earth to avoid an asteroid crash. 65 million years later, one dinosaur returned, only to discover a planet ruled by humans. And what a mess those humans have made. My name is Artius Zeradar. After pledging years studying the absurdity of the human race, I determined to right the wrongs of this inferior species by exposing its flaws. This is the Artius Zeradar Show. Welcome to the Artius Zeradar Show. In my last video, I discussed categories and how categories are not a scientific endeavor. So first, I pointed out that the categories are ideas, not tangible things. Therefore, categories are not an empirical study. In other words, they don't study using the senses. They're ideas. Study of material instances can be empirical, but not the categories themselves. Secondly, I pointed out that a scientific experiment can only postulate about the causal relation between an independent and dependent variable. That's all the experiment achieves, is a correlation describing the relation of change between two variables. Therefore, science has no method for determining the existence of categories or what a category is. So in this video, I'm going to examine how psychology attempts to accomplish this very task, this task of defining categories and of demonstrating their existence, and how psychology fails. So, two key principles I want to focus on, as I've established last time. One, science can't study intangible things. It can't study things that are not acquired through the senses. And two, it can't determine categories through experimentation. So let's begin with the category happiness. Happiness, we're going to go to this much more deeply another time, but let's examine happiness. Happiness is, number one, it's not intangible. It's not tangible. So let's start with a deduction. Intangible things cannot be empirically studied. Each premise. Minor premise. Happiness is an intangible thing. Therefore, conclusion, happiness cannot be empirically studied. So how do they determine what happiness is? Well, they, firstly, I think they actually admit that they can't come up with a clear, consistent definition. If you read some of the literature, some of the textbooks, for example, they will straight up admit this. So, I guess to some degree, we've already won the argument. But what they will do is they'll say they can come up with some imprecise methods, which are, I would argue, more than imprecise. They violate epistemology generally. Almost in every case, what you'll find is that to determine what happiness is, they simply ask. So they do a survey, and they will ask someone, for example, does this activity make you feel happy? On a scale of 1 to 10, something along those lines. Does this activity bring happiness? And how much does it bring? That is clearly not a precise methodology. You're not measuring the happiness itself. You are simply looking at what someone says, so their interpretation of what happiness is. Think about this. Happiness has been considered deeply by existential philosophers. It's a deep existential question. Think about Aristotle's view of happiness. Very different from the view of happiness by modern American people. So let's start with something like the Aristotelian view of happiness. Some people think that happiness is just some feeling, I guess you could say, some type of emotion. Where whereas Aristotle, for him, it's more of an activity, I guess you could say. It's something where you're acquiring a sense of meaning and purpose, that your actions are leading you towards a goal, an end. Telos is, I guess, and that purpose gives you meaning in life, and that's really what the sense of happiness is. So it's not just a measure of your pleasure. Let's look at, the utilitarians. They see that there are different kinds of pleasures. So in their view, there are certain pleasures that are lower pleasures, and then there are other pleasures that are higher pleasures. But if you ask a typical American today, what they'll tell you is that happiness is whatever you want it to be. There is no definition of happiness. It's whatever you want happiness to be. So this here demonstrates that we're not measuring anything, right? I mean, the very fact that you ask an American, what is happiness? And they'll tell you it is whatever you want it to be. And that's really what psychologists are typically going off of. They didn't figure out what happiness is. They didn't define it. All they did was ask someone, what do you think happiness is? And you tell us the degree of happiness you feel from this. So, for example, I saw a study where they looked at video games, and they said video games are very healthy. And I'll be honest, I didn't look too deeply into this particular study, but just on the surface, just on the face, I thought it seemed kind of ridiculous to me. Because it's very obvious that if someone spent their whole life playing video games, that would not be healthy. And that would not bring happiness. So whatever conclusion being claimed, or whatever assertion being claimed in this study seems absurd. Now, and maybe the media misconstrued the study, and I have to look at that more closely, I guess. And that's another problem in itself. But this is not an unusual thing to see in psychology. So there we have it. It cannot be studied because it's not tangible. It cannot be studied empirically. It can be studied certainly philosophically, because philosophy is all about intangibles, but it cannot be studied scientifically. So let's go then to the next question, or the next deduction. Categories cannot be determined by experiment. Happiness is a category, therefore happiness cannot be determined by experiment. So as I said earlier, an experiment is something that is deduced through, or rather I should say, it's something that looks at the relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable. Sorry, there's a dog. It's just driving crazy out here. Constantly barking. Anyway, there is a relation between independent variable and dependent variable. And that's the only thing that you can examine. And really, it's just the correlation. Now, people will say it's the causation. And that's what it's attempting to show. But at most, all you're really finding is the correlation. And that's demonstrated by David Hume. So if all you can do is, at most, find, let's say, a causal correlation between two variables, then you cannot define what the category is. So what you'll see in the experiments, again, is they will measure the variable. But so, for example, let's go back to the whole survey thing. I asked them what degree of happiness do they feel. So they have a scale of 1 to 10. Well, that would be the variable. But that doesn't determine what the happiness is. Right? So if someone says, well, I feel the measurement is 10, well, it doesn't tell me what happiness is. The category has not been determined through experiment. Rather, the category must exist prior to the experiment. And so there we see, again, the failure with the experiment. So name me an experiment that can determine not how much happiness a person experiences. Name me an experiment that can tell you, that can determine what happiness is. Think of one method of experiment that can do that. I challenge you. 2, name me an experiment that can tell me whether or not happiness exists. Whether or not happiness exists. I would argue that that would be not accomplishable either. Now, I can see someone saying, well, if we have happiness level 0 versus happiness level 5, the demonstration of 5 is demonstration that happiness exists. So you could kind of say that maybe you could do it through some kind of numerical method there. But you're not really telling me the deeper philosophical question, I don't think. I think you're kind of ignoring the ontological issue, which is, what is the nature of this thing? Again, you're kind of presuming its existence before the experiment even begins. All right, so then let's go ahead and examine a couple of other ones. Let's look at ADHD. So ADHD is a category, and it's listed in the DSM. And if what I said earlier was true, then these psychologists are just making it up. They're not using, well, at most, they're using philosophy, which they have no expertise in philosophy. So if they're going to say that we can find the existence of this thing, they're saying it through philosophy, or even, let me give them even a greater benefit of the doubt. At most, they're using induction, not scientific experiment. So induction alone does not make it scientific. Science has to be based on the scientific method. So you could say, okay, well, they're using induction and they're noticing these traits exist. I have this particular instance of this pattern exists. I've seen it exist multiple times. Therefore, the category exists. Most what the psychologist can do is show that the instances exist, instances of these particular behaviors, because that's the nature of empiricism. But to go beyond and say that there is a unifying category, well, that would be beyond empiricism, would it not? I think that it's an interesting question to just pose myself, because I could see someone making the argument that it is the nature of empiricism, and that you start with the visual observations, the sensorial observations, and then induce a kind of non-tangible principle. And so someone might actually argue that that is the nature of what empiricism is. Okay, and maybe that's fair, I guess. But I guess I'm going to just note, though, I think it depends on what our definition of empiricism is. If we're going to say that's what empiricism is, then that's one thing. But maybe if we're going to be more strict, it's to say that it's only based on observations. But yeah, you know what? Let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say that that's what they mean when they say empiricism. They're saying that we're looking at particular instances and conceiving of a principle, and so therefore we're able to kind of touch the intangible. Can you say the ADHD exists? Or what ADHD is? Again, it's a leap. I mean, you're making a leap, and this is, I mean, to go from these instances, these many instances, and jumping to the existence of an intangible, I argue that is still a leap. I mean, certainly I could see certain patterns of the mind being observed, and then jumping from there and saying, look, I see this pattern and it seems to have some kind of generality, therefore this pattern exists. But yeah, I guess I think I've stated what I'm saying. But moreover, the experiment part is really the issue, I think, where it's not achieved through the scientific method. At most, you're doing it through induction, and induction is nothing particularly scientific. Induction is a method that we've had since the Greeks. But let me press forward on this a little bit further. Not only are they claiming that there's a thing called ADHD, or rather a pattern of behavior, they're saying that it is it belongs to the category of disorder. So what is disorder? Right? Like, is there a scientific experiment that can determine what disorder is? Is there a scientific experiment that can determine that disorders exist? These are presuppositions. These are intangibles. So we're showing the relationship of one category belonging to another category, and the nature of the first category, ADHD. It belongs to the category of things that are disorders. It has a disorderly nature. I don't see any science there. Now, someone might say, well, you can make an experiment showing that as these particular patterns increase, you see an increase of stress. But there again, so why would you assert that stress belongs to the category of disorder? Are you doing that through science? No. Those are, linking, especially the word disorder, especially, I think, is particularly abstract. When you link stress to disorder, that's a leap of logic which is not achieved through a scientific experiment. Moreover, even the instances of stress themselves, like you could say raised heart rate, that belongs to stress, and it seems almost kind of intuitive for us, but intuition is not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about intuition, we're talking about science. So how do they link even raised heartbeat is a result of stress? How do they relate that? Raised blood pressure is a result of stress. Tension in the shoulders is a result of stress. These are empirical observations of stress. Well, that in and of itself is a leap. So there's a leap to get from the physical observation to the argument of stress, and then from the argument of stress to the argument of disorder. So if we want to claim that that's the nature of disorder, all of that is so much built in philosophy and the intangible and in unempirical things. And so when you link ADHD and say ADHD belongs to the category of disorder because it has these traits and so forth, that's not science. That inquiry is not a scientific inquiry. And so when ADHD is discovered, and think about it, it was discovered, right? Because we didn't have ADHD 100 years ago. So someone made the claim, I discovered this. And if they're making the claim, I discovered this, well, I'm very curious to see how they made that claim. In fact, maybe I'll do some research on this. I'll have to look into this deeper. Who made that claim? I have discovered this. How did you discover it? Through a scientific experiment? There's no way. There's no way they did that through scientific experiment. They had to have used some kind of method of categorization, which is participating in philosophy. So if someone else wants to challenge again on this, and someone has the information and wants to say, well, this was clearly done scientifically, by all means, please present your arguments. I'd be very happy to hear them. And maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think so. I don't think I am wrong. So I put the challenge forth. I put the challenge forth regardless. I'm okay with being wrong too. Let's consider that idea that ADHD, when it was discovered, what happened? What was the process? Someone raised their hand and said, oh, look, I discovered ADHD. That person was not being a scientist. That would be my argument. I cannot think of a way someone could possibly say that scientifically. I discovered ADHD. Because there are all sorts of behaviors, right? And we can look at behaviors and examine those different behaviors. And we can say, well, I discovered sadness, or I discovered my tendency to think about paper or something, something weird like that. I discovered that I think about the universe every now and then. Well, these are patterns of thought, patterns of behavior. We could, label those things and say, look, I'm being so scientific, but that's hardly being scientific. I'm just naming things that I experience in everyday life. Again, at most is induction. Simple induction is not a scientific method. So I could say that I am discovering patterns of behavior. Yeah, I'm not very convinced by that idea. So let's go to the next part then. ADHD, intangible things cannot be empirically studied. ADHD is an intangible thing, therefore ADHD cannot be empirically studied. Next deduction, categories cannot be determined by experiment. ADHD is a category, therefore ADHD cannot be determined by experiment, right? So experiment can only look at two variables, independent variable, dependent variable, and those have to be established prior to the experiment. So the experiment itself is not determining the category. There is no experiment that determines categories. Experiments determine relations. That's all. Therefore, it's not scientific. Let's go to oppositional disorder. Or is it called oppositional? Sorry, I can't remember the name, but exactly. I think it's like ODD or something like that. I'll have to look it up again. That one is particular. I raise it just because I think it's particularly interesting. So let's start with our deduction here. Intangible things cannot be empirically studied. Oppositional disorder is an intangible thing, therefore oppositional disorder cannot be empirically studied. Someone observed certain behaviors again, and they said, well, this person is violating the rules of society. That's a disorder. Okay, that to me is an extraordinary conclusion. This person is breaking rules of society. That's a disorder. How did you come up with that conclusion? You did this through science? I don't think so. This student is constantly breaking the rules. That's science? I don't think so. I mean, tell me how that's science. This person is constantly breaking the rules, therefore that's the disorder. How is that science? This person is, not showing up to work. That's a disorder. Where's the scientific experiment that shows me, oh, I didn't know that this, we thought it was just behavior at first, but now we've determined that behavior is a disorder. How is that done scientifically? Again, let me try to get epistemological here on a deeper level. I haven't practiced this thought experiment here, so I'm just going to dive in here. But when we're looking at things through the senses, all we're getting is information, data from the senses, which is, for example, sight. Let's just stick with sight. So I observe a certain behavior. First of all, how do I know that the behavior even exists? It could be that I'm delusional. So I'm getting pretty epistemological here, I understand. This is kind of my point. I want us to really think about the nature of this monster that we're assuming everything to be true. The image is all we know. We can see the image in the mind. We don't know if the thing even occurred because it could be in the matrix. That's always a possibility. So that in and of itself is an unknown. So we first make the first leap. We assume that what we're seeing is truth. Okay. So I saw the person do this defiant behavior. Well, I saw the behavior, right? Let's say someone doesn't do their homework, so I can see the behavior. How do I give it the category defiant? How do I say, okay, that's defiant? Because defiant is an idea, right? That's a category. So I want to place this particular behavior in that category. I look at the characteristics of the behavior. So what about the behavior has the characteristics of being defiant? All of this is a non-scientific inquiry. So I have a doctorate in law, and this sounds more like law to me. In the law, we do this. We look at, and lawyers do this all the time. They will shift what a thing is and say that it doesn't belong to this category or does belong to this category, and they'll be smooth about it. I mean they'll twist meanings and things. So this is a very imprecise things, if two lawyers are able to counter each other on this notion. So to say that there is that this is scientific already, I've demonstrated it's not. So now we're saying, okay, we have this kind of defiant behavior, and then we link many defiant behaviors together. And if it's something that we do against the state or something like that, just shocks me. Like, we're going to get into this in another video. I'm going to really get much deeper in this. If you read the DSM-4, just the symptoms are so bizarre. Like these are scientific symptoms, really. Someone's going against the law. There's another one. Law, completely abstract. I mean, this abstraction of the law, you could say it's human-made. Some people, argue that it's natural law, whatever. But either way you go, made by nature, made by humans, it's not something that is scientific or empirical. So I mean, the whole, so yeah, I hope you're seeing where I'm going with this. We're jumping from the immediate perceiving of the thing, which is the real empiricism, and epistemologically speaking, linking that to this other idea, to this other idea, to this other idea. There's just a huge number of assumptions to be made before we even get to the experiment. And there's no experiment to be made here, because we're trying to determine the category, whether the category exists, and what is that category. These are purely philosophical inquiries. These are not scientific inquiries at all. I was going to go further with another one, but I think I've hopefully clarified with those few examples. I think I've demonstrated well enough what I'm trying to get at. So, having asserted these things, and again, to me, this is the core of it. This whole categorization. 90% of psychology, from what I've observed, at least, I speak, especially clinical psychology, is about categorization. They have a book of categories. DSM is a book of categories. So that whole book is BS. That's kind of my claim. If you'd like to counter my claim, I welcome it. Please present your arguments, and I'll see if I have time to consider them. But for now, I think that's where I'll leave off. Thanks for listening. Have a good day.